The new Lotus Elise is without doubt one of the most eye-catching sports cars on the road today. It's a bold and stylish modern design icon. In fact, it's won awards for its groundbreaking design, and it has a purposeful stance, yet without being too brash or loud. Its swooping curves and taut lines give a broad hint that it's very much a car for people who still enjoy driving just for the sheer pleasure of it. And it's affordable, costing little more than a well-specified saloon car. This is no millionaire's plaything. But the Lotus Elise is much more than any of these things. It's a masterpiece of innovation born into a family of incredible sports cars with impeccable credentials that stretch back more than 50 years. This is their story. Nobody quite knows where the name Lotus came from, yet it's well documented that the Lotus Engineering Company was founded in the stables behind his father's pub in Hornsey, London in 1952 by a young engineer, fresh from national service in the Royal Air Force. Anthony Colin Bruce Chapman, whose initials still form part of the famous Lotus logo, was born in 1928 and entered London University at the age of 17 to study structural engineering. Colin Chapman had an empathy for all things mechanical, but his real genius was that he refused to accept that, just because something had been done a certain way for years, it was necessarily the best way to do it.
Magical man, didn't tolerate fools, used to divide his time. He would spend several months on his boat building business, which he had. He would spend several months then in his Formula One. And then he'd spend 2 or 3 months in the passenger cars, and he would just revolve around. But yes, he was a man that you had to admire, because he was a very, very practical man. Very practical indeed.
I mean, people talk about his genius. Do you think that's putting it a bit too strongly?
No. No, he was a genius. Absolute genius. And he did everything on the back of a cigarette packet. And it worked. And yeah, he was just a man that you looked up to and admired, and you know, I really did enjoy working for that company.
Colin had the quickest mind of anybody I had ever met, and as a conceptual engineer, absolutely brilliant. His detailing of anything, though, detail engineering wasn't that good. But I suppose the thing that most struck me was that he could go away having discussed something and come in the following morning having drawn a drawing with a fantastic number of lines in it that you wouldn't have thought possible to do in the night, or, you know, presumably he did sleep sometime. So really his speed of action, speed of thought was colossal. Mind you, he did win arguments quite often by the speed of thought, and I was slow and couldn't keep up with the pace of his argument. But if I looked like winning, he'd throw a red herring out which I would chase, and I'd lose track of the argument anyway, so he won them all.
Chapman had a passion for cars, aeroplanes, boats and all forms of motorsport. His adventure began while still at university in 1947, when he was also a part-time partner in a used car business, where he modified an unsaleable old baby Austin 7 for trials competitions and called it, for reasons never actually explained, the Lotus Mark I. The Mark II soon followed, again using Austin 7 parts with a Ford engine and stressed body panels, no doubt influenced by aircraft designs of the time. The Lotus Mark III was designed specifically for circuit racing and again proved to be years ahead of the competition. Chapman's intimate understanding of stress engineering produced an incredibly light machine to make the most of the tiny 750cc Austin engine with independent front suspension and a softly sprung frame. The resultant demand for Chapman performance parts, and even whole cars, led to the fledgling Lotus company being formed while Colin was still employed full-time as a stress engineer by British Aluminium. It was incorporated in 1953 with two directors, Colin and his girlfriend, later wife, Hazel, who even lent him the £25 company registration fee. To many people, the first real Lotus was the Mark VI of 1953, which was sold in kit form to avoid the dreaded purchase tax of the time. Based on a multi-tubular space frame chassis with stressed aluminium floor and side panels, the car sported independent front suspension and road holding that was in a class of its own. The choice of engine was left to the purchaser, but the super lightweight chassis and agile handling coaxed the very last drop of performance out of any power unit. Aircraft engineer Mike Costin was an early recruit to the fledgling company.
We just agreed that we would build Mark VI kits in our spare time, and that the objective was that when we got to the 9th kit, that would be our own. And so I built that from the kit and really built and assembled and modified the engine. And the deal was that we just see how it went, see how the company developed, and see if it could keep us working. I wanted to do something different from aircraft engineering, and Colin could talk people into doing things very well, and so we went on from there.
In 1955, Colin gave up a secure income from British Aluminium and began work at Lotus full-time, alongside Mike Costin and his aircraft aerodynamicist brother Frank, who joined as a consultant. In fact, Frank still worked for de Havilland during the day and Lotus at night. He was to have a major impact on the look of many early Lotus cars and married streamlined and elegant bodies to Chapman's lightweight chassis, again making the most of the engines available to them. The Lotus 11, made from 1956, is a good example of this. The car was available in various configurations, offering different levels of performance, from a fairly basic road car to an all-out racing machine that, in 1957, took a class win at Le Mans and 3 of the top 10 places at Sebring in the United States.
The car was Colin Chapman's design, but he was wise enough to bring in stress engineers for the chassis, wise enough to bring in Frank Costin, who was an aerodynamicist, to get the last mile an hour out of the car. And so Frank was responsible for the body, and it is my contention that this is the most aerodynamic car there's ever been. A Lotus 11 was tested in Autosport in 1957 with a Ford Popular side valve engine giving about 40 horsepower, and it did 102 miles an hour. And I don't think anything else was ever done 100 mile an hour on a Ford side valve. And of course they broke the world speed record in 1956 with an 11, with an 1100cc climax on 83 bhp, and that record stands today. And I'll just mention the speed, 1100cc we've got to remember, and it achieved not just for a short distance but up to 100 kilometres. The average varied between 143 miles an hour and 138 depending on the distance, which was phenomenal for an 1100cc car, and I just can't imagine any other car since that would come anywhere near it.
Lotus used this expertise to good effect in 1957 with what became their first Formula One car. The Type 12 was actually designed to Formula 2 regulations, but was later fitted with a bigger engine and run in several Grand Prix races. The Type 12 and later cars like this gorgeous Type 16 featured a new rear suspension layout, naturally enough called the Chapman strut. This involved just 3 components. The drive shaft located the driven wheel laterally, a strut member featured a coilover shock absorber controlled vertical movement, and a trailing radius arm performed longitudinal location. Neat, effective and light. 3 words which summed up the Chapman approach to engineering. The partnership was in much demand. In 1956, the Vanwall Grand Prix team had approached Colin Chapman and Frank Costin, and the car they subsequently designed won the manufacturer's title in 1958. But Frank had little to do with what some enthusiasts consider to be the greatest Lotus ever, the legendary Lotus 7. Developed in 1957 from the Mark VI, it was to become a true automotive icon and the inspiration for numerous clones over the years. The Series 1 was basic to say the least, with a chassis based on the Racing 11 and live rear axle with a double wishbone at each front corner. Drum brakes came from Ford and steering was courtesy of a Morris Minor rack fitted upside down. Ford also supplied the motive power. The trusty 40-horse side valve engine was fitted, although twin carbs were offered as an option to increase power. Versions were also available with BMC and Coventry Climax engines. The Series 2 car arrived in 1960 and featured a simplified chassis, a new nose cone and glass fibre wings. Wheels were reduced from 15 to 13 inches and a Super 7 was offered with a Cosworth modified Ford 1500 engine. The Series 3 was the definitive 7. Launched in 1968, it had the new Ford Crossflow engine and Escort Mexico back axle. Front disc brakes meant this one stopped too. Only a year later, Lotus unveiled the Series 4, a radical redesign which was longer, wider and featured controversial styling using much more fiberglass. The Series 4 performed admirably and was well equipped, but it wasn't a car for purists. The Lotus 7 continued to be produced, mainly in kit form, with 4 series and lots of options until 1973, by which time Colin Chapman had decided to move production upmarket. So he sold the rights to manufacture and market the car to Graham Nairn of Caterham Cars, the leading 7 dealer of the time, along with all the production jigs and moulds. He didn't sell the name though, so the Lotus 7 simply became the Caterham 7. Graham Nairn having reverted to the classic Series 3 design. Even now, after more than 40 years of gradual evolution, the 7 is still the car to have if you want to drive something both to and around the racetrack at the weekend. Going back to their roots, Superlight 7s with high revving motorbike engines are becoming a familiar sight and sound at track days like this one. In fact, there are probably more Caterhams racing today than any other make of car. Whilst the 7 was important to Lotus, it was always more to do with the roots of the company than with its future. Launched at the same time as the 7 in 1957 was the revolutionary Lotus Elite, which featured the world's first all-fiberglass composite monocoque body. For a low-volume manufacturer, fiberglass or glass-reinforced plastic was an exciting new material, offering endless possibilities.
There is very little metal in it, and it's totally stressed monocoque chassis. It's the only glass fibre monocoque produced at that time, and the only other car was a Rochdale Olympic, which came out a year or so later. The design criteria was it was a car which could be used on the road, but also would win its class at Le Mans. And for 6 consecutive years, it won at Le Mans, and there are not many cars that achieve that. It's the most seductive shape. Secondly, being glass fibre, it doesn't rot. And finally, to drive one, it is a marvellous mixture of an old-fashioned car and a very modern car. They're extremely quick, the road holding is beautiful, and their manners are out of this world. This car is actually a brand new body shell. The body shell of this car was beyond redemption, and you can still get the new monocoque made by a company called Hearn. This car has been built up, it's a rolling chassis, the engine is ready to go in. It may look a long way to completion, but actually the difficult bit has been done now, and this could be on the road in a couple of months. Frank Costin was involved in design, but actually Peter Frayling and Peter Curwin-Taylor designed it. Peter Curwin-Taylor was the Lotus accountant, and it was a doodle on his pad which was built into this. Frank Costin then came along and did the tail, shortened the tail and put a cam tail on it, and did the fine-tune the aerodynamics. It has a CD factor of 0.28, and it was done without wind tunnels. And the fascinating thing is the car has a flat bottom, and they're built nose down, and so they knew something about aerodynamics, but they probably didn't know what it was, but it works. And if you build them nose up, they're very unstable.
Some industry observers thought Chapman was mad, quite mad. Plastic cars, no chassis, whatever next? But Colin, as usual, was simply ahead of his time. Over 99% of all cars built rely on a monocoque construction, although economies of scale mean that pressed and welded steel is much cheaper to work with for volume manufacturers than fiberglass. The Elite was a landmark, But it proved an expensive lesson for Lotus. Its innovative design proved expensive to manufacture, and each car actually lost the company money. In June 1959, and with production of the 7 and Elite in full swing, the company needed larger premises and moved to a purpose-built factory in Cheshunt, just outside London. It was here that the original Lotus Elan was born in 1962 to replace the costly Elite. The new car was designed in-house by Ron Hickman, who later found even greater fame and fortune as the man who invented the hugely successful Workmate do-it-yourself workbench. The production Elan reverted to a separate chassis, but in true Lotus style, this was a radical departure from anything that had gone before and came about almost by accident. Although 40 years on, you can still buy an uprated Elan chassis off the shelf. The Elan was initially planned as another GRP monocoque, but this time as a convertible, which everyone said was impossible. Even today, convertible cars built traditionally out of welded steel pressings usually have to be strengthened substantially to give back the rigidity lost by not having a fixed roof. Ron Hickman's team was having a torrid time trying to make the concept work with fiberglass, and suggested to Colin Chapman that a steel chassis be constructed just for prototype testing purposes. Chapman countered with a much better idea. He told the team to actually simulate in sheet metal the parts that would in production eventually be made in glass fibre. When it became apparent that the resultant metalwork not only worked, but could be made for around £10 per car, the Elan became the first Lotus to use a steel backbone chassis, later modified and improved to form the basis of every new Lotus design until the Elise in 1995.
Well, it's a 1970 mark, and I got it in 1974. 74. My second car. I've just had a passion for the Avengers and Emma Peel, and so this immediately appealed to me, the actual car, and I think it was the pop-up headlamps, actually. It was a new thing of the times, and I fancied the pop-up headlamps, you know, the winking bit. So I've had it for 27 years. It was an everyday car when I first started work. And then when I realised it was becoming a little bit more valuable, I started to use it on special occasions. And since it's become a classic, you know, I've started using it on dry, sunny days, really.
1985, when we got married, I actually married Elaine for the car.
Yes.
1985, we were married for about 2 weeks, and I decided we'd do a chassis change, and that was due to take about a month and a half. And 5.5 years later, we'd taken everything apart, put everything back together again. New chassis, the engine's been rebuilt, everything from bumper to bumper has been taken off, changed, or refurbished and renewed.
I think it's just the actual shape of the car is so modern. You know, I think it was ahead of its times, and even though there's so many new Lotus on the road now and there's so much to choose from, it hasn't dated. I think that's the thing. I think it's very much, to me, it's very much a lady's car. The size is manageable, it still has a lot of power in it, and I think it's quite cute.
This is the third Elan I've had. This is the first Sprint I've had. The previous 2 cars I had were +2s, and I decided back in March this year to have a change, so in the Classic Car magazine, Mr. Matty came up with the goods again, and we decided to go for this one. Always fancied one, and circumstances changed where I could afford one, and so time for a change. I like the styling, the shape. I think they're ahead of their time. Certainly in the case of the +2, I think it was one of the nicest looking cars, perhaps next to a Ferrari Dino.
Over 12,000 Elans were built during the model's 11-year life, a testament to the exceptional handling and beautiful lines of a car which, it must be remembered, was launched at the same time as the MGB, which was comparatively agricultural by comparison. By the late 1960s, Lotus wanted to attract more mature buyers and developed the Elan into a 2+2 version. With up to 130 brake horsepower on tap, the +2 echoed the styling cues of the original Elan beautifully and allowed 4 people to travel in reasonable comfort, even if the +2 were children.
Actually my son's, and he bought about 7 years ago in Conway down the road, and he got moved down to London 4 years ago, and I've had it ever since. So technically it's not my car. I spend half my life in the garage, you know, on the floor under it, so why shouldn't I be here? Well, I did the stress cracks myself and then got a professional to respray it, and he'd done a lovely job. A guy local to us. It's a superb car to drive.
From the very beginnings of Lotus, Colin Chapman was aware that as a small fish in a big pond, he could never compete with the major manufacturers in terms of component costs. The company therefore forged alliances with a number of industry giants over the years. Ford supplied engines for the 7 and Elan, Renault engines and transmissions for the Europa and gearboxes for the Esprit, Toyota gearboxes and rear axles for the Excel, and Isuzu provided engines for the M100 Elan. All Elises today are powered by versions of the Rover K-Series engine. When the original Elan was being conceived in the early 60s, tooling costs alone for a pair of bumpers were about £30,000. In the end, the whole car was designed, developed and tooled up, engine included, for the grand total of just £27,000. With its racing successes and stylish sports cars gaining headlines, the name Lotus was beginning to earn recognition and respect in the early 1960s. So when the giant Ford Motor Company decided to develop its Cortina GT into a world-beating saloon racer, they approached Colin Chapman to perform some magic. The initial plan was to have Lotus assemble just 1,000 cars for Group 2 homologation, but over a period of 3 years, the company produced almost 3,000 racing and road-going versions of the car, almost all in white, featuring the classic green side flash. This wasn't just a case of badge engineering. The Lotus Cortina featured the Elan's close-ratio gearbox and heavily revised suspension, with alloy door, bonnet and boot skins to reduce weight. Road cars had around 105 brake horsepower, whilst the racing versions were tuned to give around 150 bhp and came to dominate saloon car racing and rallying. The Cortina Mark II also appeared in Lotus trim. Although over 4,000 cars were made, this car was assembled by Ford, using performance parts designed and supplied by Lotus. The Cortina wasn't the last cooking saloon to benefit from Lotus expertise. Henry Toivonen won the 1980 RAC Rally in a Talbot Sunbeam Lotus, breaking 8 years of Ford domination, and in 1981 won the World Manufacturers' Championship in the car.
It's a Talbot Sunbeam Lotus. It's a road-going black and silver, 1979, modified competition use. It's quite heavily modified, running about 210 brake horsepower, lowered, stiffened, limited slip diff, roll cage obviously. Need one of those and one of these. Standard can be lethal. They're very twitchy, very short wheelbase, not a lot of grip, a lot of power. But my one, it's a lot more refined. For track use, it's spot on. I've been playing around with spring rates and damper rates, and now it's quite a controllable car. But obviously, being short wheelbase, it can still switch ends very quickly.
It was all to do with General Motors when they purchased Lotus cars. I think it's 1987. Some time went past, and then the president of General Motors Europe decided he was going to try and produce a vehicle that basically stuck two fingers up to the likes of BMW and Mercedes. And they came up with what was actually a Lotus Senator concept, and for whatever reason it was redesigned to the Lotus Carlton, and the project was born out of, for want of a better statement, a modified GSI 3000 Carlton with Lotus engineered chassis and running gear. So there was a massive furore when the car came out about the top speed, and if you ever find any of the literature, the top speed is never mentioned in any of it. It's just down to the performance. So, but the project lasted in the region of 3 years, and they ran a total production run of 950 cars for various European countries in the UK, of which 284 were right-hand drive. So this car is number 195, and they're all individually numbered. So as well as having obviously an individual chassis number, they have a special edition number as well. It's based on the 3-litre 24-valve engine that's used in the Carlton and Senator. Capacity's increased to 3.6, just over 3.6 litres, and an introduction of 2 Garrett T25 turbos. The power output is 377 brake horsepower, unless you buy a Swiss spec car, which is slightly downrated for their emission standards. Torque is 419 pounds-foot, so you should be able to adequately pull a house.
Just with the rear wheels?
Absolutely, yeah. Which in the dry invariably don't break traction. If they do, you get a reasonable amount of warning before anything sort of stupid's going to happen. The interesting ones, depending on where you read, the official figures are 0 to 65.1, The top speed's 176. I've seen an independent report that's got the 0 to 60 down at 4.5 seconds, and a top speed of a Lotus engineer that I know who's done 187 in a standard car. The most interesting thing, I think, from my own point of view, is the fact that 7 years since the car went out of production, it's still the fastest saloon car in the world, standard production car.
Racing folklore sometimes credits Colin Chapman with designing the first proper rear-engined Formula One car. He didn't. The concept had already been tried successfully before the war in the giant Auto Union races, and more recently the Cooper Grand Prix team had already proved the combination worked well. But the Lotus 18 Grand Prix car of 1960 refined the rear-engine concept into a real winning combination, in the hands of people like Stirling Moss in Innis Ireland, and set the blueprint for almost every single-seat racing car to follow. So, in the mid-1960s, it was almost inevitable that Colin Chapman would develop this layout for a new Lotus road car. Initially designated within the factory as the P5, the Type 46 was to be the Lotus for Europe, the Europa. The Europa was launched in December 1966 and certainly caused plenty of raised eyebrows. The styling was pretty controversial and earned the unkind nickname, the Flying Bread Van. The chassis was an adaptation of the Proven backbone unit developed in the Elan, this time modified to take a rear-mounted engine. In fact, this is technically a mid-mounted engine. Rear mounting involves the engine mass falling outside the wheelbase and providing unwanted cornering forces, as in the famous Porsche 911, which only now, after 40 years of constant development and a plethora of electronic traction and stability aids, is easily drivable on the limit.
We had some good days in it before we got married. After, when we first got married, we had lots of days out. We like motor racing, so we used to use that an awful lot. And in those days, you didn't have, in the early 70s, there was no speed restrictions, and you never used to worry. I'm a bit more worried now when I go along a motorway in it, and I look at lorries and coaches and think, oh, no, I get a bit worried then. I'd been driving it a bit more this time. I never drove it up until we got it back on the road, but the gears are slightly...
The reverse is a bit hard for you now, isn't it?
Yeah, and the gears are slightly, obviously, compared to modern cars.
This car was 18 years a racing car from the original. From its beginnings, it was immediately converted into a twin cam. From the Renault engine never existed in this car. The chassis was changed to accept the engine. The engine actually protrudes into the car. It was then rebuilt down in Gloucestershire in the form you see today. It didn't race in these colours, but they were the colours of Hill. They were the colours of the Grand Prix team of the day. It is individual. The skirts on the body are individual to any of the other Europas you'll see here today.
It started off the life as a 1971 S2 Europa. I wanted something a little bit different on the road. So I decided to put a 5.8 litre Ford engine in there.
As you do.
As you do. And it meant a lot of work with altering the chassis, suspension, AP racing brakes on the thing, gearbox. There's a Porsche Carrera turbo box to handle the power. So there was a lot of work in there. It was literally a chassis up, total rebuild and remodify as well. So a lot of work. Engine starts off life as a 302 block, which is a Ford small block. I machined it, altered it considerably, so it would actually bore and stroke out to 5.8. The engine's rated at about 485, 500 brake horsepower. Oodles of torque with a long stroke. Very reliable. It runs on aluminium heads, so to run on unleaded fuel. Miles per gallon does about 22, which is quite reasonable on the motorway, but on the track about 10. So it can be thirsty when you're playing. But generally speaking, the engine's proved to be very, very good. I'm into Ford engines anyway, having built GT40s and what have you. And it's a very reliable unit. I actually instruct at Mallory Park. I'm one of the instructors there, and I instruct on the Tyrrell F1 cars there, so I get an opportunity to drive those as well.
I was going to say, you know what makes a good car. This is a 30-odd-year-old design.
Yes.
How does it compare on the track?
Comparison on the track to a Formula 1 car. But comparison on the track, yes, it handles very, very well. It really is a well-handling car. Lotus Chapman got it right in the very beginning. It went for lightness, and of course lightness you get extremely good power to weight ratio. The cars have always cornered very, very well. All of Chapman's cars have cornered pretty well. The downside, of course, of putting a stonking great V8 in the back is you increase the weight. It's increased the weight, it's just over 1,000 kilos, which is a considerable amount over the original Lotus Europa. But to compensate for that, it's the brake horsepower and having something totally different.
And if you want different, how about this restoration?
Well, this car is 1971 Lotus Europa, but it's just been rebuilt. It feels like an old Lotus, because it is an old Lotus. Because before the Lotuses we've got now, we had an S2 Esprit, and it feels very much the same as that, which is the same era of Lotus. It hasn't lost any of that at all. It's a true Lotus. Lotus are famous for their ride and handling. The handling is absolutely superb. It's a driver's car, it's not a passenger's car. You know exactly where it is on the road. You put the wheels there and it goes. But if you give it a bit too much whirly, then it'll bite back. As you can see from the body, it's not a standard Europa body. So it's the engine itself has been changed. So that's a Vauxhall 2-litre twin cam engine, uprated brakes, uprated suspension. So underneath there's modern car bits, but it still retains everything of original Lotus in it.
By the 1970s, Lotus was a truly hot name. Countless racing successes and highly regarded sports cars made the marque attractive to a growing legion of enthusiastic owners. But as Colin Chapman's tastes in road cars matured, he reasoned that his customers were probably ready for more creature comforts too. This led to the second Lotus to bear the Elite name, the Type 75, which went on sale in 1975. On the upside, the Giugiaro design car was the most stylish and sophisticated Lotus ever. On the downside, it was the most expensive and heaviest, a far cry from the company's roots of inexpensive performance light wings. The Elite was the first Lotus to use the company's new 2-litre 907 engine, allegedly developed from a Vauxhall unit, which started life in 140 brake horsepower form, and over the next 25 years was tuned and developed to eventually produce over double that in the turbocharged Esprits. A coupe version was introduced 10 months after the Elite and was named the Eclat, or Eclat, which was intended as a more affordable model. Both featured 4 seats, front engines and rear-wheel drive, and broadly similar underpinnings, essentially a development of the Elan backbone chassis with a GRP body. This beautiful XL, an updated model introduced in 1982 with many Toyota parts, is thought by many to be the best ever 4-seat Lotus. Some 30 years ago, Giugiaro showed a stunned Turin Motor Show audience a truly outstanding concept car developed closely with Lotus. It was based on a heavily modified Europa mid-engine chassis, and after over 3 years gestation was launched in 1976 as the Esprit, the first real Lotus supercar.
Very fortunate really that I was the third owner, because the previous 2 owners had spent absolutely thousands on it in maintaining it. So when I actually got it, I just carried on doing the same. Originally cost me £7,000. Must have spent about the same on it in maintenance and looking after it, and it's done me proud really. It's never really had anything major. I've won about 4 concourses with it around the shows, do picnics, runs, all sorts of stuff with the car club, and really enjoy the car. When I originally got it about 10 years ago, I was averaging about 2,000 miles a year, using it obviously as a second car. And I always maintained that Esprits, certainly old Esprits, aren't really suitable for everyday sort of use. And my other car I was running was a Lotus XL. And I actually sold the Lotus XL and then was looking for something else, so I decided I'd carry on using this. So last year I actually did 10,000 miles in it, as an everyday car, and I was absolutely gobsmacked that I was able to use it, and it actually improved the car. I mean, how, I'm not quite certain, because it's always been very well maintained, but everything sort of smoothed out, all the creaks and groans went, and it always started first time. I was looking for an old Elan, certainly about 1965, 66 Elan, but the prices were more expensive than the Esprit. So when I actually seen the Esprit, I thought, well, you know, it's in my price bracket, I'll push myself to an Esprit and just hope I don't have a major failure. I mean, I was totally ignorant about the car. I tried to read up in the classic car magazines and stuff on what to buy, but basically don't really find out about the cars until you actually go into ownership. It's my wife that actually keeps me with the car, because she loves the car so much. I think I would have changed every few years, and I think I would have gone for a more modern one, because certainly in the Esprit range, the newer they are, the better, because Lotus has continued to improve the cars throughout the years.
Colin Chapman died in 1982, and many things at Lotus changed, including, briefly, the famous badge. But the Esprit went from strength to strength, especially when a Garrett turbocharger was added. 10 years on and 3 series later, though, the razor-sharp lines of the Esprit were starting to look a little dated. So stylist Peter Stevens, who later went on to design the incredible McLaren F1 road car, reworked the basic design and came up with a familiar but massively updated Esprit, which is still in production today. This beautiful Sport 300, one of the later turbocharged 4-cylinder cars, is a perfect example of an affordable supercar that will still turn heads after a quarter of a century of evolution. In 1996, the Esprit finally got the engine the critics had been howling for, the superb all-Lotus 918 32-valve twin-turbocharged V8. Racing versions are currently producing over 550 brake horsepower, with very few changes from the standard road engine. The Lotus Esprit is hand-built to order, from its galvanized steel backbone chassis up. In one part of the factory, the rolling chassis is dressed, engine and running gear are added, whilst elsewhere on-site, the body panels are moulded and painted prior to final assembly. There's still plenty of work to do before the rolling chassis and the body are finally married up. Alongside the Esprit line is the trim shop, where seats, carpets and other interior trim panels are handcrafted for both the Esprit and the Elise. The finished car certainly looks $1 million, but fortunately costs far less. This particular car, like many of its sisters, is bound for the United States, where the Esprit has always enjoyed a fanatical following. Remember Pretty Woman and Basic Instinct? It's not only James Bond who gets to drive Esprits in movies. With up to 350 brake horsepower at 6,500 revs, the Esprit V8 accelerates from 0 to 60 in well under 5 seconds, hitting 100 miles an hour in around 10, before reaching a certified top speed of 175 miles per hour. The Lotus Esprit is a veritable rocket ship, so strap in as we explore Warp Factor V8 around the Heffel test track. Not that you'd want to do that to your tyres, of course. In 1989, Lotus relaunched the famous Elan name, but this time with a very different car. The M100 Elan featured a Peter Stevens design and Hethel technology and innovation at its very best. This time with a unique raft suspension system, still believed to be the world's finest front-wheel drive experience. It provided a stepping stone for a generation of enthusiastic hot hatch drivers ready for a move-up market. Power for the new car came from Isuzu, like Lotus at that time, also part of the General Motors group, and in Turbo SE form gave a healthy 165 brake horsepower. The press loved the new Elan, but problems making it comply with export legislation and the recession following the stock market crash contributed to General Motors' decision to cancel production in 1992.
When I got it, I got an awful lot of documentation with it which said that it was the actual car that had been used to launch the model at the Tokyo Motor Show. It was used on Top Gear. I've got videos with Jeremy Clarkson sat in it. I've got a lot of magazines with the car actually being unveiled. After that it went back to Lotus because they owned it, and it was used as a display car for quite a few years at their factory. And then was purchased by a gentleman called Peter Minchin, who actually worked for Powertrain, which was the company that was involved in the design of the M100. But it's quite unique because it's not called an Elan, it's called a Zante, Z-A-N-T-E, which is what they were originally going to call the model, and decided against it. So on its registration documents, everything, it's still registered as a Zante.
After years of being offered upmarket supercars, Lotus enthusiasts have been begging the company to return to its roots and make a simple yet innovative, exciting yet inexpensive race car for the road. A real driver's car in the spirit of the original Elan and Europa, where outright power would be secondary to great handling. Under new owners Bugatti, the Elise was launched in 1995 to huge acclaim. Named after the granddaughter of then-chairman Romano Artioli, the car answered all the critics and revolutionized the sports car market. The Elise features a hugely innovative extruded and bonded aluminium chassis, of which more later, which also formed the basic platform for exciting derivatives like the Exige and the radical 340R. If you've ever wondered what it would be like to drive a race car on the road, you could do much worse than get behind the wheel of an Exige, a road-going racer based on the Sport Elise competition car. The link between Lotus road cars and race cars has always been strong, but the Exige merges the two disciplines in spectacular style. This stunning race replica offers the full track car experience and purity of purpose, yet has more than enough refinement to make it practical for regular road use. A gutsy 1.8-litre engine married to a lightweight body shell and superlative chassis ensures that the Exige makes rival sports coupes seem tame by comparison. The appeal of the track is irresistible when you own a car which looks and drives like this one. Today, a track day. Tomorrow,
it's a derivative of the Elise. It's the same chassis, but it has different body panels, different tracking, different track, tyres, wheels, a VHPD engine, which is about 190 plus horsepower, close ratio gearbox, different steering. In fact, most of the car is different to the standard Elise or Elise, whichever way you pronounce it, and it does make a significant difference to its handling on the track and performance and general dynamics. It's quite softly sprung, but you can alter ratios like on a lot of these cars, the springs and the tyres, and lower the car somewhat, and you can buy packages to increase performance and gear ratios, which does help for the track. But it is road biased, so it's very comfortable but still extremely quick. It's absolutely fantastic. I've had several Elises and they were great fun. They're a little bit cooler because there's no roof, but this is as close as you're going to get to a racing car on the road. I believe they've made about 600 worldwide, predominantly most of them have gone to Germany and France, and it's a stunning car. I hope it stays reliable. Obviously it's a lovely looking car. It is lightweight, it's hand built, it's got the rigidity of the chassis. There is no other car anywhere in the world built to, you know, that has this sort of rigidity. It's similar to a Formula One car. It's British. It's not too expensive. It's reasonably priced for you know, there's not many around. There's plenty of pros. I could go on and on. Lotus are a fantastic company. I've been over there on many occasions, and it's still a cottage industry, but it's cutting edge, and it has expanded into the 21st century. I've had the pads uprated by Lotus, but we were warned that 10 laps is perhaps enough for any car around here, and I'd probably done 30. And so, unfortunately, it was pedal to the floor, and lots of understeer, and fortunately I just bounced around on the grass, which is relatively dry, and not too much damage. A couple of broken headlamps, spot lamps, but got away with it very luckily.
So brain fade rather than brake fade?
Absolutely, yeah.
Lotus enthusiasts are a friendly bunch who like nothing better than an excuse to get together at events like this the world over.
The Lotus Drivers Club has been running for about 25 years now. It started up basically in the Midlands, immediately affiliated to the MSA so that we could do some competition. We don't do a lot of competition, but we do a bit. But mainly what we want to do is to get people who actually drive their cars rather than polish them. Well, we don't mind the people who polish them, but we like, you know, to have people who actually get out and do things in their cars. We have a number of events throughout the year, which include such things as sprint training. We have our meetings, big shows. We obviously have pub meetings and that sort of thing, and we all go off and do different things together as well. So there's plenty of activities, and we cater for every Lotus model that there is. We'll take anybody in the club who has a passion for the Lotus mark.
We felt that there was a need for a no frills, no tinsel, no caviar and champagne parts fair at the end of the season for people who are going to spend the winter restoring their cars, and it's worked wonderfully. The attendance is probably twice what we thought, and all the traders are delighted, because if you run an event like this, if the traders don't do well, they don't come back next year, and if the public can't find what they want, they don't come back either. And we've managed to get the happy balance of lots and lots of stuff has been sold. Club Lotus has been going since 1956. I joined about 3 years after it was founded, when I was with Firestone. I wanted to get closer to Lotus. Then I joined Lotus, and I've been involved with the club now for something like 35 years, and I love it. I edit the magazine, run the office. It's £25 a year. We think that any club that charges more than £25 should run more events like this and plough the profits back into keeping the sub down. But in Club Lotus, we've got 23 area leaders, all running superb weekly, monthly gatherings. We've got the best insurance schemes, in my opinion, that you can get for a Lotus. We run technical seminars on how to rebuild the car, restore it, everything else. I'm also lucky to have some legal history or qualification, so therefore I give paralegal advice over the phone to people, which usually says plead guilty and pay up. And we just have a family of over 11,000 owners, much more so than other makes. We've got members who joined the club 20 years ago, had to sell their land for family reasons, stayed in the club because they like the mark and they like what we do, and now they're back having got rid of the kids to university or marriage, and now they bought themselves a Lotus Elan. But the heritage of Lotus now is so well established, and people just want to own one. And they're all out there, these kids come and they want to, all they want is a Lotus. And all I wanted was a Lotus, now I've got 4. Motoring magazines will tell you that there's still nothing faster across country than a Lotus Elan, except a Lotus Elise. They are the most incredible handling cars you've ever come across. And when I used to be in charge of sales at the Chestnut factory, I integrated a policy that said if a man arrived at the factory in an E-Type or an MGB, you just gave him the keys to my car and said, come back in 2 hours. And if they got a grin from ear to ear, they bought it. There was no two ways about it. They just, it was to take for a salesman to come out and say, feel that sensuous surge of power. It doesn't help you, it scares the living daylights out of them, you see. Now, I think that a 30-year-old Lotus stands comparison with a modern car all day long.
Club events are also a great place to see some real showstoppers, like this unique road-modified GT1 Elise racing car. A lightweight carbon fibre body hides a twin-turbo Lotus V8 engine tuned to produce over 550 brake horsepower. And with buttons on the steering wheel, what more could any petrol head want?
What I like about Lotus is, you know, the innovative little bits that's on the car. You know, where everybody goes around by putting a bloody great big engine in to make the thing go. You know, they make the car handle, and we've proved over the years that, you know, if you make your Lotus handle properly, it doesn't need masses of horsepower. You know, you go back to the old days at Le Mans when Lotus went and trounced them all with a tiny little engine and beat them all. And that's what I find, you know, good fun. I mean, at the moment we've got V8 Morgans in the championship that I'm running in, and how great it is to be up behind something that's got 370, 380 horsepower. The little old Lotus has got a couple of 200, 220 horsepower, and you can give them a run for the money. So it's just good fun. You know, the heritage that is in all these lovely old cars. I mean, I've got my old Elan, which was the 35th Elan built, and it is just so much fun to drive it. It really is. Every time you get in it, you get out of it with a buzz. You know, I've just sort of lent it to a friend that does American Le Mans series. He does Le Mans. Last weekend at Brands Hatch, he was out in the car and he got out and he got this big beaming grin on his face. I mean, he's used to driving 100,000-pound motor cars, and he got out this little old Elan and he said, wow! You know, and that's what it's all about.
Meanwhile, it's a typically English summer day back at the Hethel factory.
I've been with Lotus for 5 years. I actually came in working for Lotus Engineering as a project manager, working on sort of new vehicles for clients. And then I was asked to move over and start a motorsport operation for Lotus, which we did based around the sport leads. And we've now decided to enlarge that and bring some more departments in and create Lotus Sport and Performance. And I'm now general manager of that. We've really got 4 key areas that we work on. The first thing is we build specialist vehicles, so non-line builds. The second thing is we develop performance parts and accessories, which also extends into clothing and merchandise as well. Third thing is we look after the Hethel circuit here, so we're responsible for all the activity goes on that, and that includes Lotus driver training. And the fourth thing is we do have some servicing, car servicing here, and also accident repairs, which is done in conjunction with the franchise dealer network in the UK. The starting point is we run our own fleet of cars, so all the company cars are serviced and repaired here. So that's the starting point for it. But yeah, we work with dealers. A dealer may refer a car, perhaps it's overspill on capacity, or the customer's particularly asked for the car to be worked on at the back at the factory. It can be a variety of reasons, really. Sometimes it's quite a specialist job. You know, some of my guys have been working on Lotuses for 34 years. You know, so if it's one of the more specialised cars, then it might refer to do the work here at the factory rather than at a dealership. We're really concentrating on a couple of cars just at this particular point in time. We're building the Sport Elise race car. We've built 62 of those for worldwide racing, and it can be anything through to sort of club sprint racing, hill climbs, that sort of activity, through to guys who get a full endurance spec and will either do 12 or 24-hour racing, mainly in Italy, Belgium and Japan. The other car that we build is the Sport 190, which is sort of the rude version of the Elise 2, and that can either be a pure track car for people to take racing, or in certain markets it can be a road version. If we look at what we've got at the moment, for example, we've got a couple of 340Rs in. One's been customised, it's been repainted in blue. It's also having various upgrades such as a cooling system. One is a complete restoration, a ground-up restoration for a guy, which is having an engine upgrade, gearbox, short shift gear change on it, as well as a host of sort of suspension and brake mods on it. We have everything back through to a Series 3 Esprit, which is in again for a partial restoration and engine rebuild. We've got a couple of race cars which are in for mid-season rebuilds, one unfortunately for a bit of accident repair as well. And then mixed amongst those we've got general retail servicing, so through to your average A service where it's an oil and filter change. So it's quite an interesting mix of cars in the workshop at any point in time. My chief tech, Adi Fawkes, has worked for Lotus for 34 years. You know, my stores guy Jason used to work on the Esprit line. You know, so we've got a whole heap of product knowledge in here, and you need it. You know, when the guy says, I've got this particular model. You need someone who says, yeah, I know exactly what you want, and can go straight to the correct manual and explain to the customer whether that part's available. At the moment, we're getting people who want custom bodywork. So it's not good enough just to have an Elise and then to have a unique colour scheme. We're getting guys who perhaps want to make a couple of mods and changes on the bodywork. So we have our own body repair facility here, so we can do some changes on that. But that tends to be very much sit down with the client and see exactly what he wants, check the regulations and see whether we can do it. And if we can, we'll make that custom vehicle for them. The key things are, it's got to be safe and it's got to be legal, you know. So we'll effectively, as part of the quotation, we'll work with Lotus Engineering and we'll clarify exactly what we can do within the current rules and regulations. And if the client's asking for too much, we'll advise them on where it's outside the boundaries of what we think would be safe and legal. If it does comply with those, then yeah, it comes down to just defining the spec, and if the client wants to go ahead with it, then we'll customise his car.
Well, as part of the motorsport team when we were racing, obviously a lot of the parts are upgraded, but what we wanted to do is carry a lot of those parts across to our customers' cars so that we could actually build on those to make them the ultimate track day cars in effect. So just simply like 2-piece brake discs, very light, very robust, actually bigger in diameter as well, so the guys get ultimate braking, and combine these with 4-pot brake calipers and bedded pads, the cars like stop on a sixpence. And one of the popular upgrades now is the damper, 2-way adjustable. You can adjust the ride height, bump and rebound, and you can make the car very stiff if you're at a track day, but on the drive home you can just take a few clicks off and actually make the car quite soft on the road, so you don't have to just live with the ultimate setup for the track all day. Even things like cooling. A lot of the cars are going to Japan and things like this, and obviously guys are racing them, so we've done a triple pass radiator, torque biasing diff, forged pistons, higher lift camshafts. But one of the big things for us was the new tyre development. We worked closely with Yokohama to develop a track tyre. It's actually road legal, believe it or not. It will pass a British and any other MOT, but it's soft compound, maximum amount of rubber, and can knock, if you just bolt this on alone, can knock 2 and 3 seconds off people's lap times, but can actually let them explore the car's limit a lot easier than a standard road tyre itself.
So how many miles on the road would you get with one of those?
We've never really tried it, to be honest. Obviously we expect that someone can do probably 8 or 9 track days per year on the same set, and obviously you're driving a lot harder and a lot quicker on a track day than you ever would be on the road. So if you don't drive up and down the motorway, which you wouldn't really choose this tyre anyway, then they'd probably last you a season of track days. Obviously all the road cars are developed purely for the road, so they have what we call an open diff. So in a low mu situation they'll spin the inside wheel, where all race cars through history have always had a limited slip or a torque biasing diff. So now that rather than just spin an inside wheel out of a hairpin or a tight corner under acceleration, this will actually try and turn both the wheels, giving you a maximum sort of projection out of a corner or a standing start even.
Right. And what's that clutch? That's a strange looking clutch by there.
It's a different material, and it's also known as a paddle clutch, so it's a lot lighter, so you've got no rotational mass or limit, and also it's designed for like a one-use operation like a race car, so it's a smaller diameter and it just bites on these 4 points and gives you maximum grip, but you haven't got to throw the mass of the whole clutch around the whole race, only when you do the starts, and often you don't use the clutch during a race.
You don't use the clutch during a race?
No, the race cars and even an upgrade gearbox is a dog box, similar to a motorbike, so you just lift off the throttle, bang it into the next gear, and you use the clutch for pulling away and really long downshifts.
And tell me a bit more about that damper assembly. I mean, is that fairly difficult to adjust? Or?
No, it's very simple. Basically, turn the red knob there to adjust the rebound. It's got a small detent on it, so it clicks. Clockwise makes it stiffer. This one, there's just a small screw, which you just put a small spanner on and just click it. And we worked closely with dynamic suspension to actually get the setup purely for the Elise for these tyres. So you don't just buy an aftermarket damper that suits all cars, you actually buy a damper that's tuned for the Elise and tuned for the track.
It's easy to convert for track use. You know, you don't have to take 3/4 of the car apart and upgrade it. It naturally, with a few mods, you can put it onto the track. Secondly, just the whole design. You know, it's traditional Lotus, performance through lightweight. It just lends itself so easily to track use, and people find it very controllable car. And I think that's why instructors and racetracks have picked up on that. Also as well, at the end of the day, you haven't got an exotic engine in the back, so your running costs, even though you're on track, are very reasonable. So it just works as an overall package. It looks good as well.
Tell me a bit about things like the scholarship that you do with the Elise.
That's for guys who want to get into racing. First off, they want to own a car, but then they want to use that car and get into some form of motorsport. And it can be quite an involved thing. You've got to go and find a helmet, and then you've got to go and get your race suit, and then you've got to go and get a track license. And it can take up quite a lot of time, and life's really busy nowadays, and people find they haven't got that much time. So we came up with a scholarship scheme where we literally package all that together. So you buy your Elise and you enjoy your Elise, but we also put you through getting your race license. And then that allows us to enter you into some Lotus events. For example, there's a Lotus Sprint and Hill Climb Championship. So you can come here at Hethel and have a sprint on the circuit, or do a couple of hill climbs. And there's also a Lotus Race Championship in association with a couple of our dealers. And you can go and do some circuit racing as well. So it's quite a neat and tidy package. We've got a license to run sprints here, so we have an MSA license on that. We hold a couple of sprints, but the main things that we use it for, Lotus Engineering use it for confidential test work, which unfortunately we can't talk too much about. Lotus Cars use it for quite a lot of development work on new product, but what we do as well is we have a Lotus driver training experience, and we've run for quite a few years now. And that allows people, again, who've got an Elise and perhaps want to explore the limits a little bit more in a controlled environment and understand, perhaps get more into understeer, oversteer and aspects of braking. And we run various skills courses, basic, intermediate, advanced, which allow people to come, have some instruction with a Lotus instructor in a Lotus, and basically learn to enjoy their car more. We also run at a couple of other circuits around the UK as well. So it's becoming quite an extensive operation for us.
Where else do you do it?
We have, this year we're running at Rockingham as well, the Johnny Herbert Racing Experience. We also have people come here for corporate days, because they quite like the idea that they can come and have a go in the Lotus on the track, but also do a factory tour, because there's not a lot of people who have actually seen hand-built cars, so they can have a walk down the production line in the morning and come and have a look and play on the track in the afternoon.
Who dare build a car without doors or side windows or even a hood? Only Lotus. And who dare drive one? The 340R was launched as the sports car for people who live to drive and want the whole experience as raw and as pure as it comes.
Well, I initially had an Elise 111S, and that car unfortunately was stolen. And as a result of that, I was looking for a new car October last year, and saw the 340 came up, and I've always been interested in the 340, so decided to take a look at one, drove one, and just thought it was so much better than the Elise that I had to have it there and then. So I bought it pretty much within a week of seeing it, and had it ever since, and I'm not going to get rid of it.
Really? You like it that much?
I think it's a brilliant car. I mean, it's one of the most impractical cars I've ever driven, but in terms of sort of driver enjoyment, taking it on the track, round bends, acceleration, phenomenal, much better than the Elise. You can use it in rain, you need to go at speed to make it work. The rain comes in otherwise, but yeah, you just drive it really. You have the heated jacket, so yeah, that you get over the lack of heater on the thing, but it's just really the rain. But yeah, I can put all those to one side to drive the car. It's still brilliant. I mean, most other cars you see TVRs on the straights, they're very quick. In the twisty bits, most Elises are all over them, and it's much better than any other car I've seen on the twisty bits.
And if you think the 340R is radical, how about this version, the Expose? It was built when Elise project manager Tony Shute was asked by his 12-year-old son, why can't Lotus build bodies like model car makers do? The result, a see-through polycarbonate body that's 30 kilos lighter than standard and that's opened up a whole raft of possibilities. Self-coloured, changeable bodywork with hidden lighting, anyone? One fascinating prototype that was planned for production was Project M250. A bigger brother to the Elise and using many shared technologies, Project M250 was to provide a step between the Elise and the Esprit for the new generation of Lotus driver. But rather than have to adapt the design for different international markets, Lotus has chosen to redevelop the concept from the ground up as a world-class car. Watch this space, and maybe the Lotus Cars website. The new Lotus Elise was unveiled at the British International Motor Show in October 2000. And whilst it looks like a cosmetic update, the changes go much deeper than that.
Most people make the mistake of thinking that the Mark II is just a rebodied Mark I, but we've actually changed 90% of the suspension components. The chassis is different itself, and 100% of the body components changed, and even the engine, we now control it with our own ECM, so we can program it the way we want a Lotus to feel, so the throttle response, the way it drives, things like that. So the car's completely different. Admittedly, it was recognised as one of the best handling cars in the world, but Lotus, being Lotus, doesn't rest on its laurels, and the team of people were challenged to make the best better. And what happened is that originally the Elise was only planned about 750 cars per year, but with demand that moved up to 3,000 cars per year, and the Elise became its own brand. So we had suppliers wanting to work with us, where the original car, we used to take off-the-shelf tyres and components, things like this, but with the Mark II, companies like Bridgestone, Bilstein Daimler actually wanted to come and work with us, so we were able to do our own tyre development. It's a totally unique tyre to Lotus, a bespoke compound construction and actual size on the front. So it made us, we could actually tune the car really to the nth degree and get every last bit out of it.
Russell Carr has been involved with the Elise right from the very start.
The new Elise is different in that we've embodied what was good about the previous car, because that's a design icon in its own right. And we brought it bang up to date by blending the soft flowing forms of the vehicle, but with crisp intersection lines on the car, which give it a lot more dynamic tension and a lot more presence on the road. We've also taken a look at the detailing on the car, and also looked at the aerodynamic performance of the car, and perhaps most importantly, the functional aspects such as getting in and out of the car, and made that a lot more easier and more usable on the vehicle. Lotus has launched the new Elise because it's 5 years since we launched the original vehicle, and Lotus is all about doing progressive design and engineering on vehicles, and obviously it's time for us to make a new design statement. As with all Lotuses, everything we do, we strive to make it even better handling-wise, and so yeah, this car is even better, particularly the high-speed handling of the vehicle, with more progressive response on the vehicle.
It's a massive difference. What we've done is we've maintained the track performance and the fun to drive aspects, but we've actually been able to, with the tyre and damper tuning, the car's actually 30% stiffer than the old one, but it feels on the road more refined. But when you take it on the test track, it's got less roll. It's actually quicker on the track as well. Like for like power is about 1.5 seconds quicker around the same track, just on grip alone. And it's now got balanced aerodynamics as well, front and rear, with aid of a new rear diffuser and obviously the new body shape. If you look on the original Elise, the chassis sills were quite high and quite wide. And one of the complaints from our customers was ingress into the car, that you actually had to like fall through to the car. So on the Mark II, it was decided to actually cut away 50 mil of the chassis and actually make the sill quite narrow so you could actually slide into the car. But we didn't just take 50 millimeters out of the chassis and take all the stiffness. We actually made aluminium triangular extrusions that are bonded in the chassis. The car is actually lower as well. It's 10 millimeters lower, the whole car is, but it's 40 mil wider at the rear and 20 mil at the front. So it's got this sort of painted to the road. One of the styling guys actually said that they want the car to look really squat when it's coming towards you, and with the new headlights and from the rear diffuser and the light cluster, the car looks really tough on the road now. Basically the rear diffuser is there to clean the bottom side of the car up and actually clean, as the F1 cars use it, they actually use it to suck the car to the ground. You can see this one has a 3-element style rear diffuser, and it's actually longer than the car. If you look at the Mark 1, you can see that it was a fairly simple shape before, and it used some of the bodywork to actually make the length of the diffuser. So it's more prominent now from the rear, so it's actually got this aggressive look and it's more effective as well.
The new Lotus Elise is built unlike any other motor car, by hand and with great pride. Join us to see how.
At Heffel we build the Lotus Esprit and the Lotus Elise, and for General Motors we build the cars which are sold in the UK as the Vauxhall VX220 and on mainland Europe as the Opel Speedster. The manufacturing facility on the site can produce up to 10,000 units a year. On the site we have invested about £8 million in the last 3 years. £1.5 million of that is in the paint shop, and the remainder is in the new manufacturing facility that we've produced, which is very flexible. It can produce 3 completely different types of vehicle. Currently we produce 2, but capacity is 10,000 units a year. Quality is absolutely paramount to Lotus. People's expectations of any product they purchase now is so high. We've used the opportunity of the new facility and the investment that's gone in place to dramatically improve the quality of our product.
The extruded anodized aluminium chassis sections are bonded together using a mixture of space-age epoxies and anti-peel rivet-type fasteners.
Working in conjunction with GM and our majority shareholder is Proton, we've had access to modern quality techniques basically around the world. We've used the opportunity to work with these other people to bring what we think is the right quality procedures, the right quality ethics back to our site. The issues of quality for our type of volumes are slightly different to high volume manufacturers. High volume manufacturers, your quality is very much linked to making sure that machines are doing things correctly. Our quality procedures are much more linked to making sure that the staff we have are following the procedures correctly. You know, everyone knows their responsibilities for quality on the site, and everyone takes it very seriously. We have an advantage here because the finished product is very good quality, but it's also an exciting product. If you see them on the road, you feel very proud about seeing them. If you're out and people start talking about the product, you feel proud, I think, because there aren't so many around and people do aspire to own the product.
Further down the production line are dedicated workstations where sub-assemblies are built prior to fitment to the chassis. The whole factory operates on a just-in-time system with no huge mountains of components on hand. Much more efficient, but needing very careful management and the cooperation of all Lotus's key component suppliers.
When it comes to producing the car, the key feature is the aluminium chassis. That gives us that exact answer of lightweight and stiffness. Effectively, we build our cars from the inside out, which is a different manufacturing process from when you use a tin box as you described it and you produce it from the outside in. In our plant, we assemble the chassis and the rolling components first, and then the body and the trim is put on later. We build cars which have a very high option uptake, so we generally don't ever build 2 cars the same. Now that means that over the years we've concentrated on our systems to allow us to configure the cars, and we're proud that we can actually build a car sometimes within 3 days of receiving the order. We can have a completed car coming out of the factory exactly not only to our quality standards but actually to the specification that the customer has requested.
All Elises are fitted with Rover's superb K-Series engine. Depending on model, this could be anything from a basic 120 brake horsepower unit to the screaming rev-happy 190 horse version fitted to the Sport Elise Racer. The engine is mounted transversely in a steel subframe specifically engineered to take the enormous loads imposed by engine, braking and suspension components. Bodywork for the original Elise was manufactured entirely in-house. For the Elise 2, body panel production has been outsourced to a specialist company in France, and the results are spectacular. For the first time, you could be forgiven for thinking that this Lotus is built of pressed steel. so sharp are the body lines, so tight the shut lines. Now the inside of the bodywork is as smooth as the outside. Here in the body shop, panels are hand-finished and assembled prior to painting for both the Lotus and GM models. In a high-tech environment, it's good to see that craft skills are still in great demand. Back from the paint shop, the finished body panels are placed in jigs to ensure 1/10 of a millimetre accuracy. The chassis is prepared and treated at strategic points with epoxy bonding agents especially developed to join the composite bodywork to the anodized aluminium chassis. Anytime now, this chassis is going to start looking rather more like a car. Meanwhile, at another workstation alongside, doors are being assembled. While a little further down the line, the windscreen is carefully fitted and bonded into place. And then all the fiddly bits of weatherproofing and trim are added. It's the end of the line, and despite QC checks at every stage of the manufacturing process, this is where a small army of quality control inspectors scrupulously check every detail of the finished car, be it a Lotus Elise or a General Motors sports car. Dynamic testing is done in a specially commissioned rolling road cell, where every car is tested for braking efficiency, power delivery, and emissions content. Finally, a monsoon bay allows each car to get a first taste of the great British summer outside. When Lotus offered our crew a couple of gleaming new cars to road test, there was no shortage of willing volunteers. For cameraman Lee and soundman Mike, the drive from the Potash Lane factory to Great Yarmouth was to be the experience of a lifetime, covering winding country lanes, fast A roads, and busy town centres. In other words, Lotus territory. The following morning, and there's a pleasant surprise back at the Hethel test track. A personalised lesson in car control from ride and handling expert and Elise racer Gavin Kershaw in the 111S. However, after only a few laps, Gavin decided to demonstrate how you can really drive a Lotus.
Well, as a motorcyclist, I'm just absolutely gobsmacked. You know, I've never really driven anything like this before, apart from I think a TVR. But after driving on a race circuit like that, just, you know, after 10 minutes, I'm just hooked. I just want to go out and remortgage the wife.
And did you enjoy it on the roads yesterday?
I did, yeah. It was great fun. Yeah.
Tell us about driving on the roads in it.
Well, it's you can feel every little nook and cranny on the road, and it's just, you feel like part of the car, and it's just like being on a motorbike, really. You know, it's just very responsive and light, and it's just such fun, just really good fun. And if I had a spare few quid, I'd put my deposit down now, sure.
I always wanted to join the ride and handling team because they were the guys who took us around the track and scared us, and they looked to be having the most fun of everyone, so that was always the aim. It's mainly down to damper tuning. It can be on a client car or Lotus product, and it's quite a small group of about 10 actual drivers, and we're the ones that get most of the fun, to be honest. We get the most time behind the wheel and make the most use of the test track. We initially start off with what we call rough cutting. So you'll get the spring rate and the damping just about good enough so you can drive the car on the road and the track. And then really you start to benchmark cars that will be in the group. So if it's a passenger car or a sports car, you'll drive other cars so you know what the benchmark is for that standard. And then you'll start to work on the brief, where you start to increase the handling performance. When you subjectively assess a car, you have to understand the compromises, that it might be fantastic on the road but not so good on the track, but that might be where that car's designed for. So you just start on that, and then you do all the damper tuning and tyre work from there on in. We do a lot of work on the test track here because it's surprising how much work you can actually do and what carries across to the road, but on a lot of closed proving grounds as well. When we go tyre testing for the Elise 2, a colleague of mine and I went down to Rome and actually done all our testing down in a test track in Rome, wet handling and also hot weather handling as well. So you get to drive on all surfaces and across Europe as well.
And something that Lotus has always been good at is reminding road car customers of the incredible racing heritage of the marque. Special editions of the Elise have reminded us of the famous gold leaf livery, the original Jim Clark Lotus 25, and the unmistakable JPS black and gold of the Type 72. It's all very well paying homage to great cars, but it's even nicer to know that a Chapman is still looking after the originals.
Classic Team Lotus was established when my family reduced its involvement with the Formula One team. Unfortunately, we felt that we weren't doing it justice. We couldn't take the risks that my father could because of the confidence he had in his own abilities. And so we had quite a large collection of cars which we needed to look after, and I was fortunate enough to be able to hook up with 2 or 3 of the original Team Lotus mechanics to look after our collection and gradually restore them, and also offer a service to other owners of the cars that have been purchased from the team at the end of previous seasons. In terms of the cars which Team Lotus built from the Type 18 onwards, there's about 125 chassis which we know where they all are, bar 2, and we've got a pretty good idea where they might be. So there's quite a few F1 chassis, and then F1 isn't the only thing. There's Indy cars and F2. Formula Junior is very popular in historic motorsport. We do tend to specialise in the monoposto cars and also Formula 1 ideally, because the mechanics who work at Classic Team Lotus are F1 mechanics, so it makes good sense for them to be working on F1 cars. Mainly we run customer cars. The cars in the collection which we restore, we try to restore about one a year. Occasionally we'll find a patron for one of those cars who will want to race it on an exclusive basis as if they own the car. They get all the benefits and all the burdens, cost of looking after it, and the responsibility if anything goes wrong. But generally we run customer cars, which have been through maybe 3 or 4 other owners before they've ended up with the current owner, and they're keen to do historic motorsport. We do the whole motorsport service, from preparing the car, well, restoring it if they need it, maintaining it between races. We have a transporter, we take it to the circuits. And in terms of the events which we do, the Thoroughbred Grand Prix Series is the main category for 3-litre F1 cars, from 66 to 85. It's an FIA championship. The winner goes and gets his trophy at the same time that Michael Schumacher does down at Monaco, or what have you. Fortunately, the winner isn't quite as obvious as Michael Schumacher. It is often up for grabs until the last couple of races. And that's an 8-race series at circuits like Monza and Nürburgring, European series. 20 to 30 cars start each race. It's a fantastic spectacle.
And what about a current Japanese F1 star who stuffed a priceless Lotus Grand Prix car into the barriers at Monte Carlo?
Yeah, that was great, and that was a big adventure for us, and a big adventure for him. He wanted to learn the circuit, which he did. Unfortunately, before the race, he actually dinged it slightly, so he couldn't participate in the race, which was a shame. But it was, it's kind of exciting for us when that kind of thing happens, because suddenly modern Formula 1 arrives at Classic Team Lotus, and they love it. And it's interesting for us. And then 2 days after that, we ran Villeneuve in a Type 72, in fact in this car, in Lucky Strike livery. So, I think in 2 days we ran 7 cars in 3 countries, which for a small company was quite a challenge, particularly when 5 of them were running at Monaco. But we did a good job. All I ever really wanted to be was a racing driver. Obviously not enough, because I didn't get the job done. I used to race powerboats when I was younger, and I do love every aspect of motor racing, and drivers have always been my heroes, and even our customers today, I still think, God, they're a racing driver, it's always had a great appeal. It's the Lotus Type 76 is the car which we're restoring, chassis number 1 of 2. So 1974 car, and it was intended to replace the Type 72. Which had been racing since 1970 at that point, so in theory it was getting a bit long in the tooth, but didn't really work. Was slightly overweight, a little bit complicated, didn't make the tyres work any better, which was the big problem with the 72 at that point. So the 76 was shelved in effect, and the team went back to racing the Type 72s. Ronnie won 3 Grand Prix, and the Type 72 carried on for another 2 seasons. Whenever Dad had finished one car, he was looking forward to the next one, and was determined to keep going quicker. A lot of people thrive on the status quo, and he clearly wasn't one of those people. So that did mean there was a lot of successful cars, and then a few which weren't quite so successful. But the nice thing about historic motorsport is that the Lotuses often win. So I get to enjoy running these great cars, and they're actually winning the races. I think a lot of the success of Team Lotus was being anti-establishment, and there was very much the way of doing things in the 50s, and quite often it was the major manufacturers. And he fronted up along with Cooper and others, and turned the thing on its head. That was very much his character. Unfortunately, as the number of rules built up, he did come into conflict more and more regularly with the rule makers, and that led eventually to the Type 88 twin chassis controversy, which really did rather spoil things for him.
I would imagine he was heartbroken about that, because the car was hugely innovative, wasn't it?
Well, I think he was probably angry more than anything. because he'd been told he couldn't do what he wanted to do and what he felt he was entitled to do. And that just really, pissed him off, I think. Well, he used to work fairly long hours, I remember. But then at the weekends, when he wasn't racing, he'd take me to the soccer, and he was a big Norwich City fan like myself and like my children now. We go along, and so we used to go, summer holidays and then snow skiing in the winter, and so there was plenty of social, family activities going on. Completely different to his motor racing activities. I'm used to tease him a lot, and there was no way that he was the most famous man in motorsport. He was just Dad. So I think because we related so much more to that, remembering Dad at races, we never really saw him at the factory. But certainly his spirit is very much there at Lotus, and he's clearly well respected by everybody there, and his memory is treasured, which is great for us. The most important thing from the family's point of view is that the Lotus Car Company continues to innovate and go from strength to strength. We get on well with them, and they appreciate what we do in terms of preserving the history and promoting the Lotus mark at really quite prestigious events now. And the Goodwood Festival of Speed is 100,000 people, and they're all the right kind of people who might buy a Lotus. And it's working very well at the moment, and long may that continue. We've been really pleased to work together with them on the heritage range, and they're actually going to make a contribution for each car they sell towards looking after these F1 cars, which is fantastic. And also, I think they've been quite determined really to celebrate their own achievements. And now they've managed to do that for such a long time since Dad, they can now look back and say, yeah, but also remember where we came from. We can stand on our own 2 feet, which they clearly can. But they have the confidence, if you like, now to say, but let's not forget Colin Chapman.
As long as the cars bearing his initials grace road and track, nobody will ever forget Colin Chapman. Because after 50 years of innovation, Lotus has earned its place as a true automotive industry great. From modest beginnings as little more than a kit car manufacturer, the company has flourished through good times and bad, and from its Norfolk base has become a truly world-class enterprise. A massive 1 in 10 of all new cars sold in Europe have a Lotus or Lotus-designed engine. Many, many more worldwide have a little bit of Lotus in them. It's one of very few car manufacturers whose concepts regularly make it into reality. It's a company with the heritage and expertise to make the next 50 years even more exciting than the last half-century. Lotus, proudly best of British.